Graham Smith is CEO of Republic. He's a podcaster, YouTube commentator, and is frequently seen representing Republican views, no, not the American ones, on news and documentaries. He is an entertaining and informative speaker and has been speaking publicly on behalf of Republic for many years. Republic is a membership-based pressure group campaigning for the abolition of monarchy and its replacement with a directly elected head of state. Humanists, with humanism's promotion of democracy and our aspiration for separation of church and state, this is an area of keen interest to us and those who have similar interests and aims. So it should be a really interesting talk. And without further ado, may I introduce Graham Smith? Over to you, Graham.
Thank you, Ben. Apologies that the lighting in my room isn't perfect, but I'm sort of battling with that so you can see me. Firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak at the Plymouth Humanists. I'm very sorry that it wasn't an opportunity for me to come and actually visit Plymouth, but there you go. And also, I hope you're all safe and well and coping with the current crisis. I'm just going to sort of have a bit of a chat, really. It's a very different environment trying to do a talk or speech through Zoom, but I want to talk about what is, to my mind, quite an exciting and positive proposal, which is to have a Republican parliamentary constitution to replace the current constitutional monarchy that we currently have in the UK. And it is a positive step. It's not that a republic isn't simply the absence of the monarchy. It is a movement that will make Britain more democratic. It will rebalance power between government, parliament, and the people. It should, if done properly, give us a written constitution, and it would essentially take what we have, which is a parliamentary democracy, and make it democratic right the way through from top to bottom. It would also, of course, disestablish the Church of England. Well, I say, of course, I mean, it's not inevitable, but it is highly likely that that would be part of the ultimate settlement, not least because the proposal for a republic includes a fully elected upper house and a head of state other than the monarch, who is the head of the Church of England. So certainly our position is that the constitution should be secular for reasons we can talk about later. Now, when I say all that, it all sounds great, but some people still come back and say, well, okay, that all sounds very nice, but you know, if it ain't broke, why try and fix it? But the problem is, it is broke, the current system, and it can't be fixed. It has to be abolished, and the system needs to be made democratic right the way through. Now, of course, when I'm saying it's broken, can't be fixed, the parliamentary system can be fixed, but the monarchy can't. It has to be got rid of altogether. Now, there are sort of three main areas, maybe 3.5 main areas, where the monarchy fails completely. And the first one is simply a matter of principle. Now, I know as humanists, a lot of humanist campaigning is about principle as well as practical issues and prejudice and discrimination and so on. It's about the principle of equality of belief. And, you know, this is as much a part of republicanism as anything else. It's not just equality of belief, it's political equality, legal equality, and equality in our status as citizens. And it is clearly the case that in the UK, you know, the monarchy does not represent the values that most of us think are important. It is anti-democratic as well as undemocratic. It is a block, an obstacle to serious constitutional reform, because people often say, well, you know, we are a constitutional monarchy, and if we go down that road of reform, it challenges or undermines the position of the monarch. But it also, and I think this is something which I find very frustrating and very serious, is that having the monarchy compromises our claims to democratic values and ideals, because we always have to make room for the House of Lords and for the monarchy. We always have to say, well, democracy is okay, it's a means to an end, but it's not everything. And I think that's a real problem, because democracy shouldn't be a fetish. It shouldn't be an article of faith, as it were, but it is a powerful idea, and it should be enshrined in all of our institutions, and it should be in practice. It should be practiced in all of our institutions, because it is recognizing that we are equal in a principled way and also in a practical way. And the monarchy always demands that we compromise those principles and compromise that commitment to democracy in this country, because if we don't compromise on those things, the monarchy and the House of Lords simply doesn't make sense. So, so the principled argument is quite strong, really. I think I would say that there isn't an argument against it. I mean, you can only argue for the monarchy on principle if you don't believe that we are equal, or if you, through some kind of contortion of logic, believe that the monarchy is part of that equality and democracy, which I think is hard to argue, given that this is an institution that in history came from the idea of the divine right of kings. It has always and still insists that those people in the monarchy are of a higher order, are special, and should be treated as special, and are treated as special all the time in this country. So, yeah, the principled thing is quite a serious matter. But there are very serious practical issues with the monarchy as well. So, and I'll get onto the constitution in a moment, but the actual palace, the royal household, the institution that we call monarchy, is a deeply flawed institution that fails spectacularly to live up to the standards that we expect of every other public body. Now, I'll give you some examples. It is incredibly secretive. There have been historians, people that have attempted to research the monarchy and have sought access, for example, to the royal archives, who have said that it is variably more secretive than MI5 or CIA. Now, MI5 and CIA have good reason to be secretive. They have to be secretive. They need to do that in order to do their job and keep us safe. But the monarchy has absolutely no reason to be that secretive at all. Confidentiality is fine, but their secrecy goes way beyond that enjoyed by most other parts of the state. And examples are, for example, as I mentioned, the Royal Archives, which is housed in the Great Tower in Windsor Castle. This is an archive full of official documents relating to the position of head of state, and it could be correspondence between the head of state and our government or other governments or other heads of state or whatever. And it is completely off limits to the casual researcher. You have to ask for permission from the royal household to research that information. They will vet you. They will check what it is you want to use and tell you whether you can use it and so on. It is completely different to what you can do with official documents which are lodged with the National Archive in Kew. And that archive, the Royal Archive, is considered to be a family archive, even though it contains huge amounts of official information. But that's historic information. Contemporary information you should be able to get through a freedom of information request, but the palace is simply not recognized as a public institution in the definition or within the Freedom of Information Act. So there is simply no obligation on the monarchy whatsoever to reply to any FOI request. And if you're doing any FOI request to a government department, for example, who are covered by the Act, for anything that they have from or about the monarchy, then that is completely protected from disclosure. Now, this is a problem because another problem with the monarchy is the royal household have more or less unlimited access to government ministers, including the Prime Minister, of course, and they can lobby and do lobby, firstly on their own pet projects and their own agendas, and we know this certainly from Charles, and it's not believable that it's not also happening with other members of the royal family, but they can also lobby for their own interests as well. So, for example, they have lobbied for changing the Freedom of Information Act to make that stricter. They have lobbied to change the funding. So it is now an incredibly generous settlement that they have. And because of the secrecy that they have, we have no way of knowing what sort of lobbying is going on, who's influencing who, what sort of pressure the royals put on the monarchy, on the politicians, or whether the politicians are simply acquiescing for whatever reason they may have. And it raises questions about why are we giving them what they want in terms of secrecy and financial settlement? Are we giving them things in terms of changes of government policy? Are they also lobbying on behalf of some of their friends? And they have certainly have friends in some very questionable parts of the world, including the Middle East. Are they a conduit to government ministers? We don't know, because it's completely secret. To kind of top this off, this part of it, so that they can access and do access and lobby government ministers all the time, and we have no idea what's going on there, but we do know that things are going on. But we did a 3-year Freedom of Information request to the Cabinet Office to get hold of something called the Precedent Book, and this is the book that is kept by the Cabinet Office, which is, it explains how the cabinet is run, down to, for example, who sits where in a cabinet meeting, but it also explains who gets cabinet papers. And it says in one line in the middle of this rather dense document that all cabinet papers, all of them, are circulated to the monarch and also the Prince of Wales. And we raised this in the media a few years ago, and it was a big story for about 48 hours. A lot of people were quite alarmed and concerned by this, because why is Prince Charles getting all these documents? This is more access than cabinet ministers have. If you're the Secretary of State for Transport, you don't get all the documents for, say, the MOD, for example. Prince Charles gets everything. Now, if he's got access, which is secretive, and also access to all cabinet papers, he has a huge advantage in terms of lobbying for his own interests and seeing off any threats to those interests in the future. And his interests are quite substantial, because he is also the Duke of Cornwall and the Queen is Duke of Lancaster. Now, the duchies are huge landed estates. They are essentially businesses. They are property empires. They are landlords, property developers, commercial retailers, and so on. So they have a significant amount of interest in what's going on in Parliament and in government. The duchies also have, through the Queen and Prince Charles, something called royal consent, which means that any law which is going through Parliament, which requires, which affects the private interests of Charles or the Queen as dukes of those duchies, needs their consent in order to pass through Parliament and become law. This is different to royal assent, which is a formality. And this is a very real thing. Now, obviously, they don't withhold consent because they don't need to. What happens is the civil servants tailor laws to make sure that their interests are guarded and protected, which is why we have identified at least 40 laws passed over the last 40 years, which exempt or privilege the Duchy of Cornwall, for example. And some of those will say, well, whereas we might do something, it would be a criminal offence, the Duchy can do it and it's not a criminal offence, or the Duchy can do it, it is a criminal offence, but they can't be, there's no criminal sanction against them that can be used against them. And one mad example is that the Explosion of Nuclear Devices Act, or something similar to that, I can't remember exactly what it's called, exempts the Duchy of Cornwall. So Prince Charles can set up a nuclear device and he won't be prosecuted, can't be prosecuted. But there are more serious aspects to that. So, for example, national monuments legislation, if, for example, the Stonehenge was on Duchy of Cornwall land and Charles decided he didn't like it, he could bulldoze it and nothing could be done to stop him or prosecute him. Now, that's not going to happen. Thankfully, it's not on Duchy of Cornwall land, but he does own large parts of Cornwall and Devon, where there may be things of historic or natural interest which are in the way of a land development, for example, and there's not an awful lot that anyone can do to stop him from bulldozing over whatever he wants to bulldoze over in order to make another Poundbury, for example. And the duchy doesn't pay corporation tax. It has exemptions from leasehold law, which means that people that are tenants on duchy land as leaseholders are treated appallingly by the duchy as a landlord, and their rents will go up, and there's quite a difficult relationship that they have there. And this all comes back to the privileged position that they have, the legal position, the access, the secrecy, and so on. So there's the secrecy, there's the influence and all the rest of it, but there is also the issue of the cost. Now, the cost of the monarchy is not a reason to get rid of the monarchy, it is a symptom of the problem. The cost that they admit to is somewhere in the region of £40 million, £45 million a year for their core running costs, plus another 40 currently for the upkeep, for the renovation of Buckingham Palace. Our figures, which have been reported even in the Daily Express as being far more accurate, and have been accepted by experts like David McClure as being more accurate, puts the annual cost at around £345 million every year. Now, to put that into context, for that kind of money, you can get 15,000 new teachers or nurses. You can. There was a new cancer unit, I think it was, opened by William last week, and the price tag for that to build it was £70 million. And you can get another 4 of those every year for the cost of the monarchy. Now, this is an institution that is only there to do one thing, which is give us a head of state. We only need one person to do that. And the reason why it's so expensive is because huge amounts of security, a lot of which security experts say is completely unnecessary, with the bill for which is about £100 million. This also covers people that the public have never heard of, such as Princess Alexandra. The revenue and assets of the Duchy of Cornwall and Duchy of Lancaster should be in the hands of the Treasury, but we treat them as private estates and allow Prince Charles, for example, to take away an income of more than £20 million every year from an estate which is Crown property, i.e. state property. And that should be rolled into the Crown estates, and the money should be going into the government. Then you have costs to local councils. So if a royal ever visits Plymouth, make sure you do an FOI request to the Plymouth Council and the local police and ask them how much it's cost them for that royal to visit, because there will be a cost, and sometimes that can be tens of thousands of pounds for a short visit. And then there are various other sundry costs that we added, and you can find all this. We've got a report which breaks it down on our website, which is republic.org.uk. And then you have things like transport and accommodation. We pay for their palatial homes to be renovated. We pay for their palatial homes, full stop. There's at least 19 or 20 different individual private homes which we provide the royal family. And we do not owe them a living. We don't owe them a living. We don't owe them transport. We don't owe them homes and accommodation. They can pay their own way. The only person we owe any of that to is the head of state. And for as long as that's the Queen, then fair enough. We should be paying the Queen a salary and providing a budget for her office, and obviously paying for any official travel and other costs. But the Windsors routinely use public money to fly around the UK in charter flights and helicopters. I mean, Prince Charles, a few months ago, flew, well, I guess it was before lockdown, he flew from, I think he was in Highgrove, which is in Gloucestershire. He flew by helicopter to Cambridge in order to meet climate scientists, in order to lecture them on the need for cutting down CO2 emissions. And when he got to Cambridge, because of course the helicopter couldn't land at the university or the college, wherever it was, he had to meet his own car, which had obviously made a separate journey in order to then be driven to the venue. So, extraordinary expense and extravagance, as well as hypocrisy and a failure of leadership. So it is a very expensive institution. Now, I was looking, and I've done a video on this just recently about, Transparency International, who campaign on corruption. Their definition of corruption is quite broad, but essentially it's the abuse of public office for personal gain. And I find it difficult to see how we can't define the royals and the monarchy as corrupt under that definition. Corruption doesn't have to be illegal. If you're in a position to change the laws to suit your needs, then it is technically legal, even if you are still taking money off the state, which you shouldn't have any claim to. So as an institution itself, it is, as I said, secretive, wasteful, abuses public money, abuses their position for their own purposes, and so on. Now, some people say, well, what I was going to say is that there's nothing good to say about the monarchy. I've said a lot of bad things about it. I've never heard a good thing about it that I can say, okay, fair enough, I will concede that. I've never heard any of this. And what people do say, and all they can really say, all they ever do say when they want to defend it, is say, oh, well, it works and it's harmless. It's not bothering anybody. There's no power involved. It's good for tourism and the economy. It unites the country. People support it and so on. But the thing is, none of this is true, because the economic argument has been largely, well, completely demolished. I mean, there's no argument that there's no evidence that supports the idea that they help the economy one bit. The idea that they unite the people, most people couldn't care less about the monarchy. 75% were disinterested in the recent weddings over the last 10 years and the Jubilee. Polling shows people are fairly indifferent about the institution anyway, but will typically say, let's keep it, just because they also go along with this idea that it's fairly harmless. And to say it works, it works only in the sense that it doesn't all fall apart, and they're able to do things and whatever it is they're supposed to do. But that's a very low bar. We need to ask ourselves, who is it working for? Can it work better? And what's the alternative? But the other part of this is the final sort of big problem with the monarchy, which comes back to this idea that it works and it's harmless, is that actually there's a huge amount of power wrapped up in the monarchy and the crown, and it is a central part of our constitution, a constitution which is, quite frankly, pretty appalling. We have this conceit that we have the mother of parliaments and that we are this great ancient democracy and all the rest of it, although I would argue that we've only been democratic for about 100 years, because that's when we introduced universal suffrage. But the British Constitution is confusing. It is unclear even to experts about exactly what it says on certain issues. It is flexible only in the sense that it allows people in government to shift around it and to change it, whether by simply changing convention or introducing a new law, which is not a good thing. It shouldn't be flexible in that sense. It should only be It should only be changeable if there's a clear mechanism and democratic mechanism for changing it. There exists in the Constitution the royal prerogative, which are the personal powers of the Queen, which are, of course, only exercised on the instruction of the Prime Minister or his ministers. But these are quite substantial. As we saw last year with the prorogation of Parliament, these powers are less than clear. But we had this bizarre situation where, when it was determined that it was unconstitutional in that situation to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks, the argument around the Queen was that she had no choice, she had to do what she was told. Putting us in a situation where in Britain it is a constitutional position that the head of state is constitutionally required to do an unconstitutional thing when instructed to do so by the Prime Minister, which is a nonsense, quite clear. We need clarity. We need a better separation and dilution of powers as well. So then end, the idea that the government can have all these powers in its hands, which are vague, are ill-defined, are argued over and so on, is counter to democratic principles. We have the Privy Council as well, which is, the Privy Council can pass orders in council, some of which have considerable legal force, and yet there's very little scrutiny of what goes on in that council. Most of the media, most of the time, describe it as purely ceremonial, and it's nothing of the sort. It is a functional, active part of the constitution which meets at least once a month and is used to pass all sorts of orders in council. A lot of them are administrative and rather dull, but there's no proper parliamentary oversight, there's no proper scrutiny, there's no proper reporting. And they can pass orders in council which can have significant impact on people's lives, as we have with the Chagos Islanders, whose legal challenge to return home was scuppered in the Privy Council, as we had many years ago with the workers at GCHQ, the listening post with the spy centre, who Margaret Thatcher denied them through the Privy Council the right to be members of trade unions, a right which was re-established by Tony Blair, again through the Privy Council. And then, of course, we have the huge power of patronage through the honours system, and the huge amounts of royal patronage exercised by the Prime Minister and to some extent other party leaders. And that is part of the mechanism by which the Prime Minister controls his backbenchers. You have the stick and the carrot, and the stick and the carrot are too strong. Particularly the carrot is an awful lot of promises made about appointments, honours, and so on. And it was notable that in about halfway through David Cameron's first term, the coalition government, he had a big reshuffle. Quite a few ministers left cabinet. Every single one of them was knighted on their way out, bar one. And the only reason why that one person wasn't knighted is because he already had a knighthood. So, it was a very clear abuse of our honour system. It's like, I'm kicking you out, but here's a knighthood, be good, don't cause a fuss, and don't cause me any trouble. That's not what an honour system is about. That's not what it's there for. And of course, part of this whole monarchical setup includes the House of Lords and the established church. I mean, we have House of Lords is complete farce. I mean, it is a nonsense. The idea that it is full of experts is also a nonsense. Yes, there are experts there, but you can only be an expert on a certain field. I mean, Professor Robert Winston is the one that is often cited, who is an expert on IVF and so on, fertility. But he's in our parliament, without anybody having voted in there. And he then gets to vote on schools, on health, on, away from his own area of expertise, on, military spending, whatever, Brexit, whatever. So, there is no legitimate reason to have an upper house which is not democratically accountable. And other countries manage to do this. They manage, Australia elects its upper house. It's a Westminster system. The Senate in Australia is the equivalent of the Lords, and it has significant power with which to block legislation. And of course, as well as all these, the people who are in the Lords, the majority of them are party appointees. They are people who either have been MPs, who tried to get elected as MPs and failed, who are party donors or senior party officials that have become Lords. And then on top of that, you have 92 people who are there purely because their dads used to be there, or their grandfathers. And then you have 26 people who are there because the Church of England appointed them as senior bishops, which is absurd. This is a nonsense, and we should not be privileging one church over another. We should not be allowing people through some weird remnant of the hereditary system to sit in our parliament. There is no reason why we can't elect our own parliament 100% and see those people get on with the job and do it well. So the alternative then is a parliamentary democracy. So it's not a US system, it's not a French system. It is a parliamentary democracy more similar to Ireland, Germany, Greece, Italy, for example. So you take what we have and you make it democratic all the way through. You write it down in a relatively simple document, and you can look at the Irish Constitution online to see how simple that can be. You ensure that both houses are elected. You get rid of the prerogative powers, and you can rebalance then both through having an elected independent upper house and the end of the prerogative powers. You can rebalance power between Parliament and government, and by having limitations on their power, on power of Parliament and government, and a written constitution, you also rebalance power between Parliament and the people. And because you've got limitations and boundaries written down, as well as a clear mechanism for making reforms and changes, you also make it all a lot more clear about how it all works, who gets to do what job, how you get rid of them, and also how you can reform the Constitution. And within the sort of week by week running of the Constitution, the powers of government and Parliament, you then have an elected head of state who is not running the country, is not taking on a political or an overtly partisan role, but who is holding limited reserved constitutional powers. And I'll come on to those in just one second, because there's a point about changing and reforming the Constitution. I mean, at the moment, you can't go into W.H. Smith's and pick up a copy of the British Constitution. And if you get 3 constitutional experts in a room, you're going to have 3 different opinions about exactly what the nature of the Constitution is. In Ireland, you can, as I said, you can get it online, you can buy it in the shop, same with the United States, same with Australia. And most countries, in fact, around the world. And a key part of that is how you change it. People say, as I said earlier, that it's flexible having our unwritten constitution, and they often say, well, look at the United States, they've still got the Second Amendment, it's inflexible, you can't change it. But since the first 10 amendments were passed in, what was it, 1791, I think it was, which are the Bill of Rights, there have been a further 17 amendments passed in the subsequent 200 years. So that's quite a lot of reform and change. In Ireland, there have been 32, I think it is, off the top of my head, changes to the constitution since the 1930s, when that constitution was promulgated. So, and one of the reasons they can do that is because the process of doing it is very clear and very easily understood. So if you want to change the constitution, you can go through the process and lobby whoever you need to lobby to get that done. Now, the role of the head of state is to, as I said, hold certain reserve powers. And I'll give you 2 examples. If there is a political crisis where Parliament is struggling to form a stable government, a head of state in that position can step in and can facilitate talks, or, if necessary, invite someone to form a government and then test to see whether they can keep that government going in Parliament. And that is quite a powerful, useful role. It provides a certain reassurance and a certain stability if Parliament is in a position where it is struggling to form governments. The other example is if Parliament passes a law which is unconstitutional, the president, who would be expected to sign that law before it comes into force, would be able to say, well, hang on a minute, this is unconstitutional, you can't do this. And there are different mechanisms for them resolving that conflict. Now, either Parliament backs down, or they rewrite it, or they insist that it goes through, and then the court can adjudicate and decide whether the president is right or wrong. And this happens in places like Germany and Ireland. I think I'm right in saying that in Germany, they also have a degree of personal discretion where they think that a law is fundamentally against the interests of the German people. But in Ireland, it's purely constitutional question. Now, there are 4 countries which are worth looking at in terms of the role of the head of state over the last 10 years, which are Greece and Italy and Belgium and Spain. Now, all of those countries over the last 10 years at some point have had political crises where they have struggled to form governments. And in all of those 4 countries, their heads of state have had an active role to play in facilitating the process of keeping the political process going, appointing caretaker or technical governments in the short term, inviting people to form governments and so on. Now, you'll know that there's a big difference between Italy and Greece on the one hand and Spain and Belgium on the other hand. Spain and Belgium have kings, and they are involved actively in this process, and yet there is no accountability. No one has decided to put them there, and no one can choose to get rid of them if they feel that they've made the wrong decision or handled the crisis badly. So, if we're going to have a head of state that has a serious role, and I don't think there's any point in having a state that doesn't, then it has to be a role that is accountable. The moment that someone is able to make decisions, it has to be an accountable position. What we have with the Queen, and this is one of the big myths, this idea that the monarch is independent, above politics and non-partisan. The Queen is entirely partisan. She's only there to do what the Prime Minister of the day tells her to do. Now, yes, of course, she'll do that regardless of who the Prime Minister is, but she will always side with the Prime Minister. She'll always do what the Prime Minister tells her, and she will never act independently. And she has made it abundantly clear in the run-up to the 2010 election and every election since, when we have, unusually for this country, had elections when there has been a high expectation of a hung parliament, and have had them on a couple of occasions. It's been made abundantly clear by the palace that the Queen is not going to get involved in any way, shape or form, and it is entirely in the hands of the politicians. Now, we managed to make that work. The balance of numbers was such that the governments were able to be formed, but it could have been different. We could have been in a situation where it was very difficult to form a government, and there was no head of state to offer any kind of function or facilitation and so on. So that's broadly it, I think. I mean, the bottom line is that, we are, as a country, Democrats. We do, and certainly should, in my view, believe in equality, political equality. We should be participants, not spectators, in our constitution. There should be no part of our constitution which is off limits to the public, to the people. There should be no entry signs to any part of our constitution. And we should insist on, and we deserve, institutions that live up to the very highest standards of probity, accountability, transparency, and so on. And the alternative is exciting because it makes us participants. It gives us greater power over parliament and government. It disperses power. It forces us to share it more. And it gives us someone who can be elected by us, from among us, to represent us, not on the political stage, but on the national and international stage as our primary ambassador, as the elected head of state in the republic. So that's it from me for now. Thank you very much. And I will happily take questions. And I think there's an awful lot of comments already on the comments section.
So our first question is from Mary Fletcher. And her question is, how can we interest more people in changing the monarchy?
Well, I think that where we are at the moment is that most people don't care that much, which is a big change in the last 30 years. And the sorts of things I've been talking about, people do care about, but they don't hear it enough. And I mean, I've done plenty of debates and talks where I've seen people in the middle of the evening change their minds on this kind of thing because they have suddenly heard about the abuse of privilege and the abuse of position, or they've thought about the Constitution for the first time. So it is, like any campaign, it's about getting more people to engage with the issue and to listen. But I think the argument is very compelling. There's a fairly recent book written by Norman Baker, the former Liberal Democrat minister, called "And What Do You Do?" And he was saying that people who he knows in Parliament and outside of Parliament who have always been indifferent to the monarchy have sort of read his book and said, look, I am now persuaded, because they've stopped and thought about it. So it it is about just doing more and more work. There's no quick fix, there's no silver bullet, but it's about people like us finding ways to get this message out to as wide an audience as possible. I also think that, you know, the next 10 years is going to be really challenging for the monarchy. The Queen is likely to die before the end of the decade, and that's going to be a game changer as well, because it does put the issue on the map. You know, it gets everyone talking about it and thinking about it, and that's going to change the whole nature of the debate and the relationship that people have with the monarchy.
Yes, I think that'll be very interesting to see how people feel about that. Sounds like a good book for the book club, by the way. I hope somebody's taking notes. Next question from Paul Huntley. Hopefully I'm reading this correctly. What is your take on the attempt to make the House of Lords elected? In the election, all three main parties said they would support this, but both Labour and Conservatives have blocked this in Parliament when it came down to it. Why?
Well, the reason why the parties, Labour and Tory particularly, want to keep the Lords, sorry, I mean, they'll say they don't, but they're happy to keep the Lords because it, two reasons really. It gives them that power of patronage, allows them to put people into the Lords and gives them, opportunities to reward people for political service and for donations and so on. And the other thing is that if you replace it, the new upper house will be stronger than the current one, and they don't want a stronger upper house. You know, they want government to be able to dictate what Parliament does and Parliament to do it. And where the Lords does stand up to Parliament, to government, there's a limit to what they can do. Sometimes the political reality is that what the Lords do will force the hand of the government, but if the government is determined, they can get around the Lords pretty easily. So it is just self-interest, you know, and I have to say that the Labour Party has been guilty of that as much as the Conservative Party over the decades. So, you know, there was a Lib Dem MP years ago gave a talk for us in Parliament. He said there was a joke going around at the time: how do you address a Labour Party donor? And he said the answer was "my lord," because it is, it was said that every Labour Party donor at the time who'd given more than £1 million, or whatever the figure was in the House of Lords. You know, which is extraordinary. You know, that is, there's a very British way of doing corruption, which is sort of to do it out in the open and make no fuss about it. It's very odd. But that's essentially why it is sustained, and it needs it. You know, there's been a reform movement going on for 30 odd years around the Lords, and it's still no further ahead. Then there needs to be some kind of moment where people are sufficiently appalled that they want to get rid of it, or where the government feels that actually, you know, it's no longer in their interest to keep it, and they get rid of it.
Yes, it sounds like they're not highly motivated to do anything about that at the moment.
Not at all, no.
So we have a question from Martin. He's asking what Republic's position on PR is.
Well, we are strictly a single issue campaign, so we don't take a view on PR. Our assumption would be that in a new constitution, all of these things would be up for discussion. I would personally think that PR would be introduced as part of that new settlement, and certainly in the upper house. I think that the newly elected upper house ought to be elected proportionally, but also perhaps have some kind of equal representation for regions and nations of the UK. But I mean, that's my view. I mean, we tend not to get into that because we are a single issue campaign, in the same way that the Electoral Reform Society doesn't get into the issue of the monarch, although they have, years ago, they did engage with us on how a president might be elected. But yeah, we don't cross over too much, even though there is some affinity between the causes.
I'm going to sneak a question of my own in here because I've been a little bit lazy. I've not actually read this news article yet. I think I remember something coming up recently about Charles being in contact with John Kerr with regards to the dissolving of the Australian Parliament in '75.
Yes.
Did you? I think I might have even seen it on your Twitter. Do you have any comments on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, there is. I don't have it here, but there is an excellent book called The Dismissal Dossier, written by Jenny Hocking, who's an Australian academic. And if you want to know more about what happened in 1975 in Australia, that is definitely a good book to buy. Essentially, what happened earlier in the year is that the Australian High Court decided that they should release letters that had been exchanged between the Queen and the Governor General, John Kerr, in 1975, in the run-up to John Kerr's decision to dismiss the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. And it's just come out from some other source, as I understand it, that there are also letters from Prince Charles to John Kerr after the dismissal saying, you did the right thing, don't be beaten down by your critics and so on. I mean, Prince Charles was only in his late 20s at the time. I mean, the presumption and arrogance that he can somehow write to John Kerr, essentially, for all intents and purposes, a foreign head of state and talk in this manner is quite extraordinary. But it is a very direct intervention in the politics of Australia. It was a hugely controversial thing for John Kerr to do. It was probably a huge spur for the Republican movement in Australia, which is the next Labour government was the one, or the Paul Keating, who was the treasurer in the following Labour government, and then the Prime Minister, who was the one that suggested moving away from the monarchy. And that would, there's a lot of support from people who were around at the time of the dismissal. I mean, essentially what happened is that for years, John Kerr said, look, I did this all on my own. I didn't tell the Queen until after I'd done it and so on. And these letters showed that actually there had been communication between the Queen and the Governor General for months leading up to this dismissal. The dismissal itself was blatantly unconstitutional and completely outrageous, and the Queen knew about it, knew what Governor General was thinking about doing, and completely failed in her duty, in my view, to A, tell the Governor General to stop being an idiot, and B, to failing to advise and warn the Prime Minister, which is what she's there for. She should have written to the Prime Minister and said, this is what your Governor General is talking to me about, and written to the Governor General and said, yeah, you can't do that. You have to take your cue from the Prime Minister. So, but then he decided to sack the government and appoint the opposition leader as Prime Minister, despite the fact that the Labour Party Prime Minister had a majority in the lower house, which is the constitutional basis for government in the parliamentary system. So, yeah, it's a shocking and complicated episode in Australian history, but the fact that Prince Charles felt that he had something to say about it and then said it is pretty appalling.
Yes, it's certainly left a scar. I think, depending on how many questions we have, I might ask you about your thoughts on how the vote went in Australia all those years ago. But I'll let other people's questions in. Martin has asked. You've mentioned cost. How much does it cost in comparison with Germany and Italy? I'm presuming he's asking sort of like the costs of a presidential head of state versus our version.
Well, I mean, it's substantially more expensive. I mean, the German head of state, last time I looked, and it was a little while ago, was about 25 million a year compared to about 345 million. The Irish head of state is cheaper still. I think it's somewhere in the region of 10 million a year. I'm not sure about the Italian off my top of my head. I think for some reason they're more expensive, but I don't know why that would be. I think that the point is, you only have to think about it logically in the sense that we have a secretive royal family who feel that they can use public money all the time for their own travel, accommodation, and palaces and all the rest of it. And there are, 15, 16 of them. There are 20 plus homes and all the rest of it, all of which have to be guarded 24/7, even if they're not there. In somewhere like Ireland, it's someone who has been elected to the position, who hasn't had a life of sort of regal pomposity, and who only needs one official home, a salary, limited security for that person and maybe the spouse. It's just going to be a lot cheaper. And also they will be expected to be entirely transparent about their finances and have it properly audited and counted and budgeted every year. I mean, the royals don't do that. They don't. Their funding is not based on budgeting. It's based on an entirely artificial calculation based on the profits of the Crown Estate, which has nothing to do with the royal family. But it just goes, if the profits of the Crown Estate go up, the money we give them goes up. And if the profits of the Crown Estate go down, the money we give them stays the same. And so the money we give them will still keep going up, even if the money they're spending isn't going up. So they build up a surplus, and then they can just choose to spend it however they want. And there's no proper checks, balances, or accountability whatsoever.
So a bit of a different question from Mary Fletcher. She asks, do we need two houses?
Yes, I mean, there are people that say no. I mean, New Zealand doesn't have one. New Zealand is a unicameral state, as of course is Scotland, which is obviously not a separate state, but I mean, it's a separate polity, if I can put it like that. But I mean, in New Zealand, they had a similar situation to the House of Lords, and quite a long time ago, I think it was in the 1950s, they did a review, and they realized that the previous 3 decades, this upper house hadn't amended or reviewed a single piece of legislation in any meaningful way. So they thought, well, there's really no point in it being there, so they got rid of it. But they have a much stronger committee system, and 20 odd years ago, they introduced proportional representation, which makes it unlikely that you get a majority government, although they do now have one as of last week. But the reason why I think it's important is because of the division of power. So if you take Scotland as an example, they have an electoral system which is designed to ensure that no one party has complete control. And so there has to be a degree of consensus and bargaining and so on. And then, what was it, 2011, I think it was, the SNP won an outright majority. And all of a sudden that mechanism, that design looked flawed, because there was only one House of Parliament, and the Scottish government had a majority in that Parliament, and there was very little that any of the opposition parties could do to challenge or hold to account the government. And that would be the same in the UK, in Westminster, if we had only one House of Parliament. The lower house, the House of Commons, is by definition in the parliamentary system going to have a majority, whether it's made up of one party or more than one party, who are going to support the government, at least in confidence and supply, and usually in everything else as well, as either a majority government or a coalition. So as much as you break down the power of the whips or the power of patronage or whatever, the lower house is usually going to support the government position. And so the upper house gives you an opportunity to have parliamentarians who are not in that mix. The government doesn't need a majority there, may well not win a majority there, and politicians can then challenge, block, debate. And the logic of Parliament should be that government asks Parliament to pass legislation. It doesn't instruct them to do so. And in this country, Parliament is more or less co-opted by government as a means by which government can pass legislation. And I think that's the big problem. We need a Parliament that has the ability to actually do a reasonably independent job. Now, it's not a complete separation as they have in America. It's a parliamentary democracy, which I think has got lots of strengths. But the upper house is a key part in making sure that there is that a degree of separation.
Right. Before I go to the next question, because I think the next question's from Mary again, I was just going to sort of ask, did you, given how the vote went in Australia in '99, is that a reflection of how things might go if it ever got put to the vote in the UK, or do you think that's any kind of indication, or do you think, how do you think people would vote in the UK if it was yeah, a public vote?
Well, I lived in Australia at the time. I paid close attention to the Australian situation, talked to their my counterpart in the movement and so on. It's complicated. I mean, a lot of what happened in 1999 was complicated by a number of factors. Paul Keating proposed a referendum in the early mid-90s, and John Howard, at the end of 13 years of Labour government, the Conservative leader, John Howard, was determined to win back power, and so promised a referendum as well, even though he's a staunch monarchist. And they devised a situation where this Constitutional Convention would come up with an alternative to the monarchy, and it was a model of head of state which no one really wanted. It wasn't directly elected. The appointment process was flawed. It divided the Republican camp. There were actually Republicans saying vote no because we want to do it properly later on, which I think was a huge mistake. But also I think that there was an element of, you know, this is an issue driven by people like Paul Keating. It's not an issue that is of concern to ordinary Australians, and, you know, why are we being asked this question? And the case wasn't made strongly enough, I don't think. And also the incumbent Prime Minister was a monarchist. The opposition party was only recently out of power, and everything was, it just wasn't conducive to a win. Since then, the polling has steadily moved in the direction of Australians wanting to get a republic, and certainly now I think that is moving, that support is becoming firmer because people are thinking more about the prospect of King Charles. You know, 20 years ago that was a distant prospect, and now it is a very real thing which either this government or the next government is going to have to deal with. And so, you know, all these people that said let's wait for the Queen to die, you know, now we're having to deal with that. You know, you can't actually wait for the Queen to die, because then people will say, well, let's wait for Charles to die. And they'll say, well, let's wait for William to die. You know, someone is going to be on the throne when you get rid of it, so you have to start biting that bullet. In this country, I think that, I mean, some people say, it's often been said to me in debates and things, look, you know, if you had a vote on this tomorrow, you would lose. Now, of course we would, but we wouldn't have a vote on it tomorrow. We would have it after several months of debate. You know, if you'd gone back to 2014 and said to UKIP, or UKIP said, you know, let's have a referendum, you would have said to them, look, if you have a referendum on Europe tomorrow, you know, you're going to lose. But it wasn't done tomorrow. It's done after months of arguing and campaigning, and Britain voted for Brexit. And the same is true in Scotland. Now, they lost, but there was a huge shift in polling in Scotland, or in voting, I should say. I think it was something from 30% polling for independence before the referendum was called, and then 45 voted for it in the actual vote. So you don't know how we're going to vote until we do it. And I think, given what I was saying before about getting people to engage with the issues and seeing people change their minds, I think that you would see a significant shift. Whether it would be enough to win first go round, who knows? I don't know. But it's a big thing to change. It very much depends on who the monarch is, what has been going on in the news, what sort of issues are pertinent and so on, and how well people campaign. But what it would do is, if we ran that campaign and lost, it would still fundamentally and permanently change the relationship that the British public have with the monarchy, because it's then there on our collective permission, as it were. So, you know, it is then contingent very clearly and directly on our view, and there would be an argument later on for another referendum for the next generation, as it were, to make the same decision. So we only have to win once. We can lose a number of times, but when we win, that's it. It's done. No one's ever going to bring a monarchy back. No one ever has brought a monarchy back through any kind of democratic process. So it would happen.
Cool. Right, sorry, I'm just trying to find the next question. So this is an interesting one from Mary again. Do you agree it's a form of abuse to require the royals to live a peculiar life where they cannot speak out in public? And could this be a reason to abolish it and liberate them?
Yes, I do agree. And it's what they call the gilded cage. I mean, they have pretty strange lives and they are pretty strange people. And I think, I don't want to get too personal, but I think it's arguable that Prince Charles is a damaged individual because of the weird upbringing that he had. I think that Harry and William have had some difficulties with the way in which they were brought up, and certainly Harry has spoken about this bizarre expectation that he be paraded in front of the world's cameras just a week after his mum's died at the funeral, and I think that must be damaging, that must be harmful. Now, I'm not going to be overly sympathetic because they have everything they could possibly want, but material wealth isn't everything, of course, and even that itself can be quite damaging. But there is an argument there, and there's also, I mean, even with Prince George, who's only, what is he, 5? 7 now, isn't he? Yeah. I don't know. It's slightly tragic that I know that, but he's already having his photo taken and being put in the papers. His privacy being invaded. His, people talking about what sort of kid he is. People even arguing over what presents he gets when David Attenborough gave him a fossil from Malta, and immediately it became an international incident. But George has already been told that he's going to have to marry a woman in order to have an heir, regardless of what sexuality he might be. He is going to have to be a practicing Christian in order to go to church and be the defender of faith and all those things, regardless of what he might believe personally about God. He's going to have to do military service, regardless of what he might feel about doing that. And he's going to have to then sacrifice any chance for a normal life or a career of his choosing or any kind of privacy in order to be the heir and then be king. And that is an appalling thing to put on any child, and I think it's quite clear that that's done Charles a great deal of harm, and it has given him a very distorted view of the world and of himself, and I think that's a tragedy. So, it's the Diana death and funeral and outpouring of grief and so on was a really telling moment of this strange relationship that supporters of the monarchy have. The supporters of the monarchy are the ones that are cruelest towards the royals because they expect them to live to a completely false set of standards, and if they don't, then they attack them, and then they say, then they attack other people that attack them, and then they demand, they say, press, leave them alone, and then say, but we want photos of them. It's a very strange relationship that they've got, and it's other people who either don't care or oppose the monarchy that are probably nicest to them and would be nicest to them because if we get rid of the monarchy, they're still here, they still have plenty of money, they can go and live their own lives, do what they want, and if they want to be private citizens, then they can do that, and that's entirely up to them. If they then choose to do what Harry and Meghan are doing, for example, where they continue to seek the limelight, then fine, that's what they want to do. They can't then complain if it bites them in any way, but if that's what they want to choose to do, then that's up to them, but they should be able to choose to simply walk away and have nothing to do with it.
Yes. So a good reason, but perhaps not the biggest reason to
No.
get. Right. Well, that leads rather nicely on to Paul Huntley's question. Just linking to what you were saying about what they might do as private citizens, um, or how that might work. So his question was: would a revised monarchy work that was purely ceremonial? Reclaimed the crown as an asset, abolished the royal list. We all know that's a cash cow, as Paul mentions. But yeah, so I mean, what are your thoughts on a sort of revised monarchy, and is that even a possibility?
Well, I mean, it's not worth it. I mean, what's the point? I mean, there's nothing good about the monarchy, really. It doesn't do anything of any value. What is the point of having a ceremonial monarchy? Because the ceremony that it talks about is incredibly traditional, small c conservative. It doesn't represent Britain. They want to have these ceremonies privately in the way that the Masons might do, then fine, good luck to them. But why why at the public expense? Why as an official state institution? If we get rid of the monarchy and the royals want to continue calling themselves, king, queen, princess, whatever, then good luck to them. But there's no reason whatsoever why the country should have anything to do with that at all. It just isn't any point. There's no benefit to having a monarchy one way or the other. And in terms of ceremony, I mean, it's sort of the idea that it's symbolic, but the monarchy is symbolic of all the wrong things. It is symbolic of the worst of our history, and it is symbolic of inequality and hereditary power and privilege, of deference and all the rest of it. So it's a symbol that, quite frankly, we could do without. And I would be very pleased if the members of the royal family at the time when it's abolished fully accept the end of the whole thing, and we scrap all the titles and they go off and be Mr. and Mrs. whoever, and live their lives in private.
Right. Okay. So if there's any more questions, if you can just put them up on the chat now. I think we've had quite an in-depth and much broader sort of picture of how things are with the monarchy and the various pros. Well, I was going to say the various pros and cons. I'm not quite sure how many pros there were, but and how it all fits together. I'm just chatting for a couple of moments longer in case anybody wants to put anything up. So this is this is quite I think quite a nice one to finish on. So it's to do with, I don't know if you saw it come up, so the questions about MBEs and stuff like that, and you might even want to comment on, I don't know, I'd be interested to hear your comments on things said by people like Benjamin Zechariah on MBEs and all of that thing. But I think that could be quite an interesting one to finish on.
Yeah, I mean, I did an interview actually. I've quite a long time ago, about 11 years ago, I interviewed Benjamin Zechariah on this subject, and because he did a poem about this, because he was offered an OBE and refused. And for him, it was to do with the empire and how offensive it was, given his history as a poet and a campaigner, to be offered an imperial title. It was just absurd. And he was pretty angry about it, and also pointed out that even people like Queen Victoria had a hand in the profits of the slave trade and so on. Even though we had abolished slavery by the time she became the Queen, she was certainly living off the profits of it. And the empire was a pretty atrocious thing, and the idea that we still hang on to parts of it and sort of still use these bizarre titles, I think is completely absurd. But it sort of goes beyond the titles, because the problem is the honours system, and I've used the word before, and I use it for the honour system very clearly, it is corrupt. Which is not to say that everybody who has an honour has got it through for corrupt reasons, not at all, but it's corrupt because it's not about awarding people for what they've done, other than in the very limited way. It is primarily about awarding people who are in very senior positions, who are within a certain echelon of society, who, as I said before about David Cameron, awarding political friends for favours done, or awarding potential political enemies as a way of saying, keep your thoughts to yourself, awarding donors and so on. I went to Parliament several years ago and gave evidence, to the committee that was looking at the honour system. And it was Bernard Jenkins was chairing this committee. I cited an example. I won't, can't remember his name actually, but I won't say it anyway, just in case he sees this and sues me for libel. But there was someone who had given a lot of money to the English National Opera, and he'd also given a lot of money to the Conservative Party. And then he was given a knighthood, ostensibly for giving money to the English National Opera. And I said, well, if you go to the average person in the street and you ask them why he got the knighthood, they're going to point to the money that they gave to the Conservative Party. The other thing, of course, is that he was a multi-millionaire. I think he gave £1 million to a charity. Well, why is a multi-millionaire giving £1 million different to someone who's only got £100 in their pocket giving £10? I mean, why are these people being given knighthoods for their apparent generosity? But the knighthood or the honours that get mentioned in the news, as we had recently, when it's the people that have, the unsung heroes and the people that have done loads of charity work, and the guy that did the pub quiz online during lockdown and whatever. Some of that is a sincere award for what they've done. Some of it is about essentially creating a, sort of throwing out like confetti, hundreds of very junior awards in order to sustain the process of handing out much more prestigious honours to the people that are in these upper echelons of society. And I think that is appalling. I think it's incredibly patronising to people. I think it's notable that if you are, an ordinary person that has done something, that you'll probably get an MBE rather than a knighthood. Where if you've done a lot less, but you happen to be a friend of the Prime Minister, then you'll get a knighthood and maybe a peerage. The whole system is based on quotas, so they have 1,000 honours to give out twice a year, and they have to go and find people to give them to. And it's like, well, if you're going to have to find them, then why are we giving them? I mean, surely we should have a process where someone has done something exceptional and we know about them through whatever means, and we then award them. So I think the whole thing is completely skewed. And going back to the original question, I mean, it's not just the imperial titles, it is also the fact that with acknowledgement and recognition comes status, that you elevate these people, and that we are supposed to then, sort of doff our caps to knights. And I've seen people I've seen Republicans take knighthoods, and I just think, well, what are you doing? You're actually thinking that people should call you sir. And Ben Kingsley several years ago was knighted, and he did a press conference, and a journalist asked him a question by calling him Ben, and he corrected him and said, you should call me Sir Ben. And the reaction was hostile, to say the least. And he took the point. I remember years ago when I lived in Bath, there was a local councillor who was a sir, and because he was incredibly pompous. And there was one time where he tried to cut into a queue in a local shop, and the person told him to get to the back of the queue, and he said, "Don't you know who I am?" I mean, I think he literally said that. And the guy behind the till said, "Yes, I do. That's why I'm telling you to get to the back of the queue." And it creates this pomposity and this arrogance and this hierarchical sort of, attitude that is completely at odds with democratic principles. So I would sweep the whole lot away and replace it with a single, simple, honest system where people who have done singular acts of bravery or who have committed themselves in a way that is a genuine sacrifice are recognized. And in terms of national awards, that should be a fairly limited number of people. And if it's about doing something for your local community, then there should be perhaps local community awards, which have a similar sort of status. But no award should then also elevate you to a higher status.
Right. Excellent. We're come to the end of the questions now. In a moment, we'll allow people to demute themselves so they can show their appreciation. But just before we do that, is there any sort of final thought you'd like to leave us with, or a piece of advice how we can push the idea forward? Last word to you, essentially.
Well, I guess the main thing really is that this is obvious, and it should be obvious anyway. I mean, there isn't a single reason why we should put up with a family that is taking us for mugs and fools, and that is spending millions of our pounds every minute, when we are struggling to fund schools, hospitals, and police forces. It should be fairly straightforward that we're a democracy, therefore we should elect our head of state, and any questions or concerns about that can be answered. It is not a difficult thing. Quite a long time ago, when the God delusion came out, it was suggested to me that I write a book called The Monarchy Delusion, because when I read the God delusion, I felt that the reasoning and the arguments are not that dissimilar, other than the fact that you can prove the monarchy exists. The rationale behind supporting it is not far off the rationale around religion. And I say that as a humanist myself. I mean, we have plenty of religious people within Republic, but I say that now because obviously I'm speaking to humanists. But I think that this should be a no-brainer. And if you want to see it happen, it will happen. All the biggest challenges in the world seem impossible until they happen. And it all starts with small steps. And one small step can be, whether it's joining or getting involved online, sharing content, simply telling your friends and family about what the discussion we've had this evening and so on. So there's plenty that can be done, and it's going to be, thousands of small steps rather than one big action. But it's what we have coming up in the next 10 years is the first succession in the modern era, in the when we are decades into being a democracy, when we have 24-hour social media, when we have an air that is not fawned over and doesn't enjoy the same deference and sycophancy that the Queen does, and a society in which a Republican movement can grow, can speak freely, and can campaign, which simply didn't happen and didn't exist in 1952. So the whole situation has changed as far as the monarchy is concerned and our democracy, and there's absolutely no reason why we can't achieve this in my lifetime and in yours.
Thank you very much. So Tim, if you can do the honours and demute, hopefully that everybody will be able to clap or something. Okay, so thank you very much.
Always, thank you.
Never works particularly well, but the thought is there. Brilliant.
I can hear it all the way actually from Plymouth. So.
Right, so thank you very much. Yeah, like I said, that was very entertaining and interesting, and I'm a massive proponent or fan of this idea. Not quite sure how to phrase it, and there was a lot more in that than I expected, so that was brilliant.